going to give it a second for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started.
My name is Meg Nash. I'm a partner in our Boston office. I am also a Maryland barred attorney, and have been very fortunate to work with a number of applicants and licensees in Maryland over the past few years, and I've just been thrilled to see the market kind of evolve since the legislation and ballot question passed, and just kind of watch it progress. And thank you all for joining us here today so that we can kind of catch up on the next steps of the licensing process, which is inherently going to involve looking for property.
I am Casey Lever. I'm the Director of Compliance at Vicente. What I do is largely help our clients go from, I describe it as like a piece of paper, right? So you've got the license. Now what? Getting through inspections, creating floor plans, creating partnerships with really good vendors that can help you maintain compliance, help with advertising, packaging and labeling, and all different types of reviews that set you up for success. Once you're operational, what I do for our clients is, compliance audits. The way I look at it, you'd rather have me send the message than a regulator. So that's kind of me, the friendly face sending the message, rather than a regulator with a different tone coming at you. I help, worst case, I try to prevent them. Worst case scenario, there is any compliance issues or any violations, I work with our attorneys here in the office to, respond to enforcement actions, create plan of corrections, and, keep our clients on the up and up. So here in Maryland, I'm going to be doing the same, helping Meg navigate inspections, general operations, and helping our clients succeed in the Maryland market.
Okay, so just to kind of start with a brief overview of what we will be covering today. First off, just want to orient ourselves to kind of where we are now and where we're going. Second, touch upon what the property search is going to entail and really some of the things that should be on your radar as you dive into this process. Casey is going to lead us through some compliance considerations, really focusing on the different license types and the different operational requirements. Obviously a retail site is going to look a lot different than a cultivation or manufacturing site, and have different considerations, particularly where you're sort of consumer or patient facing versus more of a, insular workplace, and along with the kind of the regulatory requirements that go over that. Then we'll move into what it's going to look like when you execute an agreement for property, because there's really kind of three different choices here, and you're going to want to think about what's going to make sense for you. Then we'll kind of touch upon how the construction, build out, and inspection process is all going to inform this process as well. And hopefully we'll have a few moments of questions at the end. All right, so where we are now and where we're going. As most of you likely know, the Maryland's first social equity licensing round closed in December of 2023. That was followed up by a lottery in March of 2024, where applicants were awarded kind of pre-approval for licenses for dispensaries, cultivation, and processing, both on the micro and standard scale. There was also a subsequent lottery in June of 2024. So those pre-approvals were recently announced as well. We are aware of the fact that many of the March 2024 selectees have now begun to receive conditional licenses, and we expect that that process will continue to kind of, roll out on a rolling basis over the next few months, not only for the March selected applicants, but also for the applicants who were notified in June that they were selected. And what's important about this conditional license, not only is it kind of the next exciting step in licensing, but it also kind of kicks off requirements with respect to the subsequent steps in licensing, including the supplemental application, operational components, and importantly for our purposes of our discussion today, kind of the property search. So if we'll just move to the next slide, I just want to flag some important deadlines to keep us kind of oriented to clock. So the conditional license kind of sets off the clock with respect to this 6-month timeline, where all applicants are going to be required to provide proof of capitalization and must also complete the supplemental application process on One Stop. This process, if any of you have received a conditional license, you've likely been able to log in and see the type of information that's requested. It's a lot about, disclosures related to ownership, other information, kind of additional due diligence, kind of following a lot of the information that was submitted with the initial application. So it shouldn't be an overly burdensome process, but it is one that needs to be completed, on these kind of strict deadlines. And I anticipate that there will be further requests from MCA with respect to kind of all the promises that applicants made in that initial application, like what are your SOPs for fire safety management and employee workforce training? So kind of the sooner you're able to kind of get your ducks in a row with the supplemental application, likely the better. You don't have to wait kind of full 6-month window if you can do it sooner. The other clock that it kicks off once the conditional license is issued is this 18-month window to get operational. So that means that, probably by January of 2026, you need to be ready to have doors open, have been through the whole licensing process, inspections completed, security system installed, really soup to nuts, everything's ready to go. There is, some wiggle room here with respect to requesting a 6-month extension. If you can demonstrate to the MCA, like, I've done everything I can to get this moving and open in 18 months. We just need, a couple more months, 60 days, whatever it may be, to get it over the finish line. But there's obviously some real tangible benefits to becoming operational in advance of the deadline. Right now, Maryland's cannabis market is being 100% served by the medical converted licensees. So as soon as the new licensees can kind of get up and running and start to chip away at some of that market share, the better, you're going to have certain early mover advantage there. So I want to flag that property control documentation is not specifically requested for the supplemental application, but it is recommended to try to secure property in this first 6-month window as soon as you can. Part of that is tied to the fact that you're going to have to show proof of capital within the first 6-month window, and it'll be challenging to kind of calculate the exact capital that you need without knowing some of the property costs. What's your monthly rent going to be? What are utilities going to look like? Those types of things, to kind of really demonstrate what the capital you're going to need for the project is. Obviously, I think the MCA is going to have some wiggle room there because any number of things can happen on kind of the path to getting up and running, but it is going to provide a bit more clarity and assist in the overall planning process. So to the extent that you can kind of check this box off in the first 6 months, I think it's ultimately going to benefit your business goals and operations. In addition, there's almost inherently going to be a component of local permitting, some construction, the degree of which could vary depending on the initial site. But that's going to require you to want to build in some lead time as well, because the physical site itself can have a real impact on your operational strategy, because it's going to take kind of the regulations from being in a vacuum to the regulations being applied to a location, and what does that look like, and what do you have to do to get it there? Okay, so with all those things in mind, kind of where we are and where we're going, kind of pivot to thinking about how to search for a property. The importance of real estate from a licensing perspective is, first, that it's a component of your final licensure. You will not be able to get a final license if you cannot show proof of control of a physical location. And you're going to want to kind of dig in on these cannabis-specific issues and try to get them out of the way early as you go through this property search. So one thing that frequently comes up is the use of personal guarantees if you're entering into a lease. A lot of times, most of the new licensees are not going to have a long financial record. Many of them are newly formed entities. that were just formed for the purpose of applying for a license. So it's not like a landlord is able to kind of look back at what your profit and loss sheet has been for the past few years. So they're probably going to look to the owners of the applicant entity themselves for some sort of personal guarantee included with the lease agreement. So this could be, the individual on the license, or to the extent that you're bringing on additional investors, they may be asked for kind of to provide a personal guarantee with respect to the lease agreement. So you're going to want to kind of look into that. I flagged here the kind of know your tenant due diligence. If anyone on the call is, a landlord who potentially has a compliant site, you're going to want to engage in your own due diligence as to who will be taking over this property. So some things that you can kind of expect to come up in this process, they're a bit outside the norm of other commercial lease negotiation processes. In addition, there is going to inevitably be some site selection and zoning that you're going to have to comply with. That's going to be kind of dictated at the county and municipal level. And we're still sort of watching that process evolve across the state of Maryland. Some municipalities are kind of adopting any pre-existing medical rules that they had and just kind of flipping that to apply to the adult use market as well. Others are going through kind of more of a democratic process of getting input, feedback from people in the community or, city council members to come up with new zoning. So you're going to want to kind of keep your eye on that as you advance through this process. And particularly thinking about setbacks as that relates to retail locations in particular, and kind of knowing your neighbors. One other thing I wanted to flag here is that particularly, as kind of abundant as cannabis seems to be in so many different states, and legalization has come a very long way, and descheduling is on the table. Cannabis is still, a Schedule I narcotic under the Controlled Substances Act, and there's inherently going to be some friction there between federally insured mortgages. So this is primarily going to come into play if you're looking at, a location that's in a strip mall. You're trying to lease a site that's in an area that may have sort of an anchor tenant, like a Walmart, someone like that. There can be clauses in those kind of master tenant leases or mortgage agreements that are going to prohibit, any uses at the site for federally illegal activities. That is, perhaps drafted not to intentionally bar state licensed cannabis companies, but nonetheless can have an impact there. So I just flagged that to the extent possible, you can find a standalone buildings. That's likely going to eliminate some issues, but obviously the market is going to kind of dictate what's available. So you're going to want to try to get ahead of this to the extent you can when you're kind of engaging in your initial property due diligence and identifying sites. Other factors to consider when you're choosing a location is to kind of look at the population. And this is going to be kind of less relevant at this point because I'll flag that, if you want a retail license in Baltimore County, you have to operate in Baltimore. I imagine that people started to kind of look at these demographics before they decided where to site their location. But it's going to be important to kind of dig down on where you think you're going to have the most success, both from a consumer basis and also from a workforce basis. So you're going to want to be able to obviously recruit talent to your operations, kind of have enough people in the area that are going to be able to commute to work, get to the site. So to the extent that, as you're kind of looking for locations in Baltimore County, if you're a retailer, you're going to want to make sure that, perhaps you're on a busier roadway, to kind of make sure you have exposure to consumers in the region, that you'll be like a high traffic count, so that even if you don't have sort of intentional people who are coming to your store, you're going to catch the attention of people who are just driving by. Similarly, kind of looking at cultivation or processing sites, you're going to want to think about, potential proximity to highways or other avenues for distribution to retail partners, to think about kind of how these operations are going to come into effect. So, while some of this, may seem somewhat instinctive, the goal, of our presentation is to really try to tie in all these operational factors that are going to inform what kind of makes a good site or a less desirable site, because they are going to kind of come to bear as you get up and running. And at times, just finding a site can be a bit of a myopic process. But to the extent that we can kind of zoom out and think about all these things that are going to impact your day-to-day operations, we want to try to offer that insight to everyone here today. Other factors to consider when choosing a location is to think about proximity to other dispensaries. So for a retail conditional licensee, there's going to be certain setback requirements from other licensees. You're going to have to think about it from that perspective. You're also going to think about it from a competition perspective. You're not necessarily going to want to be within such close proximity to other dispensaries if you can avoid it, so as to kind of capture a bit more of a population radius to come to your store as opposed to another store. But kind of on the flip side, for cultivation or processing licensees, you may want to think about, where can I locate that I can quickly make, distribute to a number of different licensees. So I've included kind of the map here and a link to find this information that is retail focused. The Maryland Cannabis Administration has a very robust data dashboard. So I would encourage people to kind of consult that as well when diving into this property search. I touched upon this before with respect to the municipal and county considerations, but want to really kind of, it deserves its own slide. So we're going to pause here for a second to kind of think about the setback restrictions, opt-outs, and additional zoning considerations. So the setbacks, there's going to be kind of setbacks from sensitive uses and receptors that apply to dispensaries. There's a state setback requirement that I'll show you on the next slide in just a moment. But each municipality has the ability to kind of reduce those setbacks or, provide other contingencies with respect to zoning. So it's important to kind of get a grasp of what those are early, because you can likely use them to eliminate sites that may, be otherwise appealing. Maryland, I think, had learned wisely from other jurisdictions to not give local municipalities too much control. So municipalities in Maryland are not permitted to opt out from hosting cannabis establishments, except for on-site consumption licensees. None of those licenses have been awarded yet, so I don't expect that this would necessarily impact anyone on the call. But so you should kind of have your pick, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be kind of unique challenges on a location to location basis. Similarly, the political subdivision requirement, they're under the statutory authority, they're allowed to establish reasonable zoning requirements, but that obviously is somewhat subject to interpretation. Both Casey and I are up in Massachusetts and have kind of seen this play out here in our home state, where municipalities do have a little bit more leeway in terms of local control. And there was recently a lawsuit here where, a certain city had enacted such restrictions, like you can't be 100 feet of a residential zone, where it was basically, there was basically one property that would have worked in the entire city and it wasn't available for lease or rent. So we haven't really seen that evolve in Maryland yet. But again, there are certainly, counties that are friendlier or less friendlier to the new industry. So something you really want to hone in early as you start your property search. I also wanted to flag here kind of the importance of knowing your neighbors and abutters. As I said, there will be certain setback requirements, but in addition, it'll be helpful to kind of go out as you start to think about a site, kind of meet who's there, see what the temperature is. Most commercial leases or purchase agreements are going to be 3 to 5 year terms. So you're going to want to kind of check those soft factors, if you will, in addition to the more tangible factors like setback and zoning approval. So the specific setbacks under the statutory authority that dispensaries can locate within 500 feet of a pre-existing primary or secondary school or a licensed childcare center or registered family childcare home, as well as a playground, recreation center, library, or public park, or 1,000 feet of another dispensary. And municipalities are permitted to further reduce this distance requirement. So some of this, when you read it, seems very, clear and straightforward. And okay, if I find a property, I'll kind of check for these uses. But then you can get into like, well, is a dance studio a recreation center? Like, what does that mean? And kind of get these tortured interpretations. It can be one of those things where, again, if your neighbors are welcoming to you, they'll be like, well, we don't consider ourselves a recreation center, no problem. Or they can show up at your special permit hearing and be like, we don't want this person, locating at this place. So again, kind of important to do this due diligence up front with respect to setbacks, particularly to these uses that could be interpreted and it kind of in your favor or not in your favor, depending on who's looking at the term. So just wanted to make sure we're kind of dedicating a specific slide to this to put the rule out there so everyone is aware of what the statutory requirements are. Just to kind of summarize this section, I think before I pass it over to Casey, as you go into this property identification, you're going to want to try to move as early as possible, really cast a broad net in terms of drumming up potential sites so that you can engage in this due diligence process, hopefully get a list of, top 3 to work with. Additionally, you're going to want to engage counsel to assist with the real estate components, as well as the zoning components, kind of the municipal checks here, engage with the municipal officials as needed, to ensure that you're kind of set up for success from the outset, because once you move into the execution of legal documents, there's going to be a lot more teeth there, and you want to make sure that you have kind of feel confident going into the agreement. Also, what we've seen in other counties, it's important to just kind of budget for delays. There can often be, local zoning challenges. If you have to get on a public hearing schedule, that's done at the municipality's clock, not yours. It's not like if you want to go on a Tuesday, you can't. And just most importantly, to have patience. We kind of put a lot of information out there about things that can go wrong. But I think that with the right kind of counsel and support and kind of both the micro and macro lens of how this can work, you'll absolutely be able to find a place that you'll be excited to have your license operations.
All right, now for the fun stuff, the compliance considerations. So, as Meg's talking about site location, all of that, there's some other things that you want to start thinking about right away. It's one thing to have, a site location in mind. It's another to be able to take, 4 walls and make within that what is going to be required to operate the business compliantly, effectively, make it through inspections, and really set yourself up so you're not in a position where you get through an inspection, but when it becomes effectively operational, you've got a problem. One of the first considerations that comes to mind for me, because it's something that I see as a stumbling point quite often through an inspection process, kind of a last minute consideration, is backup power. It's going to be required to support your security system, your backup power, right? But more than that, right? You only have to do, I think it's 48 hours of backup power. So that's one thing, right? You've got your backup power. Now your backup power is going to be required to support your security system. Beyond that, you want to start thinking about like product preservation as well. If you're a processor or a cultivator, yes, maybe I only need backup power for the security system, but am I really gonna risk my refrigerator going down? Am I gonna risk, damage to the plants because the lighting wasn't on that day, or overnight, situations? And then when you're looking at the building, what is the generator situation? Is there one there? Okay, maybe there's not. So when I'm working on the build out, thinking about how I can get one there. Do I have to install one permanently? Can I just have an electrician get one of the generator plugs from the exterior of the facility? Just something you want on your checklist. It might be something that when you're looking at a property, you say, wow, well, that's great that it has that, bonus points. But something to keep in mind as you're looking around. Obviously, total square footage, the usable space and the functionality of that space. We'll get into it in the next couple slides, but where that becomes really, really important is the floor plan design and on the processor side, where you do need to have separate areas for certain things. The areas need to have washable floors, walls, and ceilings. So thinking about, okay, this is a great location, but it's going to take X, Y, Z to get it where it needs to be to operate. And what are the required operations within the space? If you're looking at a dispensary, which we'll get into next, there are certain zones that you need to consider and barriers that need to be in place. So just looking at it, putting your boots on the ground and saying, like, how can I actually see this working out? Seems obvious, but sometimes when you're actually in the facility, in the setting, you have to be able to envision it, and ensure that there is reasonable space, because sometimes on paper it looks fine, and then you're standing there and all of a sudden you realize, well, this is a 2 by 4 foot vestibule. Now, pre-existing features, they can really win a location. Drive-throughs are permissible for dispensaries. So if you're considering a drive-through, if you find a property that is a former, McDonald's or something, or a former bank that already has that window, it likely already has the zoning as well for the drive-through if that's required in the municipality. So it's something that, given a slew of options, if you're going to do a drive-through, that may also give some bonus points to that location. Security considerations, existing doors, structure shape, and fencing are things that come up all the time. Where are the existing doors? Will they make sense based on the flow of your operation? I think of this where, you've got your employee entrance, you've got your customer entrance, depending on the type of facility, and you've got your cannabis entrances. So what exists already for that operation within that space you have? Then the structure shape. Is it a square? Is it something with a lot of turns and angles, and existing walls are going to need to come down? What exists there, and what challenges are going to present themselves based on what is currently in its location? And then fencing. If you're in cultivation, for example, and you wanted to have a fence around the facility, does that already exist? That's super helpful in some cases. In some cases, it's not. If there's a fence around a dispensary, that probably isn't quite as welcoming. Shared spaces, huge issue, or can be. If you are, again, like in a strip mall, like Meg gave the example, not only could you have an issue with landlord considerations, but is there a shared electrical box, let's say? Because it's going to be an issue from a security perspective that another tenant can come in and pull your electric. Not necessarily something that you can't work around or, make some changes to address, but something to think about, like what facilities, what utilities are shared here? Shared hallways, is that going to fly to have, customers come in the same entrance to a dispensary as they do a dentist office? What is the impact on signage if that is the case? So really thinking about shared spaces and how this can work or possibly not work for you. Server rooms. The regulations are very specific about security and the security recordings, security equipment, having an independent alarm for that space, and limiting access. So blank slate, you'll be able to build up walls however you want, but just something to think about is, how am I going to protect that area? And is this something that already exists? Because it'd be great if it did. And now we're going to dive into this license specific. I'm only going to go over a dispensary, processor, and grower. We could go on all day about all different other license types as well, but we'll hit the primary 3 to start. For dispensary specifically, vault requirements. Okay, so the vault has to be concrete or similar material, can have one door, can't be visible to the public, and not on an exterior wall. Very important to think about. It's probably, one of the primary things on your checklist as you're thinking about, will this space work as a dispensary? Where am I going to put my vault? You're doing your floor plan. Where can this vault go? A lot of people will say, oh, this is so great. We have an existing bank. Got a great bank vault, drive-through window. I love it. I'm like, okay, well, the vault size could be a problem. Bank vault storing cash is significantly less requirements than space-wise than 150 SKUs that you're going to want to have at your dispensary. You have to store all your cannabis products in the vault overnight. So what you got there is what you're going to need to work with if you choose something that has an existing vault. Other thing with bank vaults or pre-existing vaults to consider is HVAC and temperature control considerations. So if you're looking at a space like that, it's not out of the question, but they're just things you need to consider as well. Then your fulfillment models, right? So how do you plan on actually dispensing at your facility? The regs do say, that essentially all cannabis other than it's being displayed, packaged, or dispensed during business hours has to be kept in a secure room, the vault. This is something you can go back and forth with your inspector on to determine what is considered being like dispensed during business hours. And that would allow for you to say store and maybe locked cabinets or something behind the point of sale versus having, fulfillment room that's attached to a vault. So think about what that fulfillment model is going to be, what limitations you have on space to fulfill the way you want to. You also have a public versus an operational zone to consider when you're thinking about a dispensary. Your public zone is your waiting area and your service area. Think of service area like your sales floor. However, your service area is restricted to verified customers. What that does is create the potential for you to have to think about, how am I going to restrict them? Is it going to be a physical restriction? Am I building a vestibule? Is that what that means? Pretty standard. In most, if not all, Maryland dispensaries is to have that, just the physical vestibule. Now I'm thinking about, okay, well, if I have a vestibule, is it just an entry vestibule? Is it an exit vestibule? What does the customer flow look like? So again, something to start thinking about right away when you're looking at this dispensary is, it's not just like, oh, there's a sales floor, here's a vault, we're good to go. Think about those zones that you're going to have to create. Operational zone is like your back of house, essentially. There's obviously far more details in the regulations, but big picture, think of it like your back of house. Waste and returns. Where is waste going to be stored? Where are your returns going to be stored? This kind of plays into that vault size. And will you be disposing on site or sending it back? Most commonly sending it back, but either way, it's got to be stored at some point. And then you have record storage. Now, records for all license types have to be stored securely. They also need to have an alarm system for where the records are stored on site. And you're thinking, well, that's easy enough. But a lot of people tend to store records in spaces that are like an office or something. And maybe, and typically they wouldn't have an alarm on that door in that area. But you will need to consider that when you are planning out your dispensary processor or cultivator, actually, in Maryland, is that record storage is a real big focus of MCA. So again, these are just kind of the considerations as you're finding the space and starting to draw out that floor plan. Now, this is grower. Now, I would say, so dispensaries, there's a lot of moving and a lot of requirements on how that's going to be set up, right? Grower, same thing. The hardest I'm going to say is probably a processor, and we'll get to that. And it's very regulatory heavy on what a processor has to do, their cleanly operations. But in the middle here, we have a grower, right? If you're a grower, you need to think about hand washing sinks. They have to be easily accessible. They have to have warm water, and there needs to be one per every 15 agents on duty or any fraction of 15 agents. If you're going into a building, what you want to consider in that case is, what is the plumbing situation? Are there existing sinks? Are we talking about having to re-plumb in hand washing sinks? Every however many square feet you have, how many rooms are going to need them? Just something to consider when you're looking at these properties. You need to quarantine anything coming in for like soil or any ingredients or anything like that, and you have to inspect that prior to use. So you want to make sure you're thinking on your floor plan, okay, so it may make sense to have some sort of a receiving vestibule in that space, make within that your quarantine area, so there's no contamination beyond that. Another consideration there. Overhead doors, not on my list, but something I think about with growers, processors, that overhead door and receiving area, super helpful, especially when you're talking about getting your fertigation equipment in, getting any kind of general equipment in during your build out. So that sometimes will win over location as well on the grower side. Water source. What is your water source? Is it a public water source? What's my RO system plans? Like, what are we looking at here? Test that water. What's coming in? Is this usable? Am I going to have to treat it? Find out what's going on there. Any like general agriculture or environmental issues certainly want to be discovered sooner than later, especially if you're using the public water source. Pest monitoring control. You're looking at a facility, you go out to see it for the first time, you want to keep an eye out for signs of, erosion and pest damage, or anything that says to you, well, the current operator probably has a problem with mice, for example, because there's traps everywhere. Little signs that you just want to keep an eye out for. They may seem like common sense, but when it comes to like MCA and regulations, it's going to end up costing you a lot of money to ultimately prevent if there's a larger issue at hand. Green waste. How are you disposing? Where are you disposing? What are you using to dispose? What are you using to grind up? Does this require equipment? What size? All of that, start thinking about right when you get to that floor plan stage. Contamination prevention. Again, this is more on the floor plan side, locker rooms, any type of requirements that you're going to have for your staff. Where are those locker rooms going to be located? How much space do you need for like protective clothing, PPE? All of these things you want to consider as you're looking at the overall size too of your facility. All right, now into the processor. Got a lot of work for you processors out there. Same thing, we got our hand washing sinks. We've got to, take care of that. Water fountain and dispenser for your employees. They have to have access to water. So we're going to need to make sure that's a consideration. Again, back to that plumbing concern. PPE and locker rooms, same thing. Got to have a place to change, get your PPE. You need an area for quarantine and disposal. Again, just thinking about space-wise. OSHA compliance, access to SDS sheets. Easy enough. Binder, that's probably not as hard. Chemical storage. Where are you going to be storing your hazardous chemicals? All ladder storage, toxic chemical storage. All of these things you're going to want to consider up front. Because these are things that when you really start operating, you can't just like leave it out in the parking lot. You can have like a 55-gallon drum of alcohol on a 90-degree day in your parking lot. You're going to have to think about where that chemical storage is going to be. Now, if you're doing extraction, there's a lot more requirements on that end. And certainly if you're coming in knowing you're going to do some extraction, think about the cost of, ensuring that space is a spark-free environment, proper ventilation, fire department inspection, C1D1, C2D2, like any type of requirements that you're going to have. If you can look at a facility and know this is going to be a lot of work, or maybe there's an existing one. I mean, it could be out there. You could end up in a situation where there's an existing facility that's set up for you. Make that easy. And again, these are also things that it could be a future expansion discussion. You could become operational, know that when you're looking at a facility, okay, well, I'm going to use 3/4 of this now, and then I'm going to go through the process of getting construction approved and build out the rest. I could do a whole nother webinar on what that looks like, on how to actually get approval to do the construction and the things you need to think about if you're operational doing construction. But again, look at a building, look at where it's at right now, look at where it's at, look at the potential, and know that this doesn't need to be the forever picture, to the extent that you're able to expand on it. Additional considerations here, we can go to the next slide, for edible production. So edible production has a lot of requirements, obviously, and especially if you're going to do the high dose edibles where you have to have a GMP audit. That's a whole nother level. But the general edible production also requires you to have edible production separate from an area used as living quarters. Kind of speaks to that shared space thing, but something that Lawrence pointed out in the regs. Ingredient and product processing storage has to be separate from other areas by tight walls, ceilings, and self-closing doors. We're going to probably hit on this last about choosing vendors, but I can tell you that self-closing doors aren't quite as it's not intuition necessarily to put these on every single door. So you're going to want to also find a vendor that understands where a self-closing door is going to be required. This in particular for processors, super important that you understand that. Refrigeration and ventilation, where are your, ingredient storage? What is it going to require? Is it refrigeration, dry storage, frozen storage? What does that look like? And what is the ventilation? Because you have to have proper ventilation in these spaces. This next one's my biggest one: washable floors, walls, and ceilings, impervious to water. If you go into an existing structure that has that, that's wonderful, right? But then you should be thinking about, what is it going to take to get there? Am I putting up walls? What are we talking about here? You're going to think about that with your budget too. What is it going to take to do that? Making sure wall joints, and then your overhead structures. So I've looked at a lot of different buildings like loft spaces and these absolutely beautiful buildings, and people want to turn them into, product processing, right? Okay, nice, great looking building. But they've got a massive pipe that is above it. And unless you're able to seal that off and make sure that there's no dripping, there's no HVAC condensation, nothing like that can drip or possibly get on ingredients or products in process. So again, think about the ceiling as you're looking at some spaces. There's artificial lighting requirements as well that you're going to consider, and floor drains. You're going to have a slope that allows the floor to drain. So start thinking about that. Are there existing floor drains? Is this something I have to put in? A lot of considerations, but don't be overwhelmed. It's just that there are a lot of regulatory requirements that you should consider. And then I think I might even have some more in edible production. Next slide. I do. Lovely. Bathrooms. You're required to have separate gender segregated or gender neutral bathrooms, one per every 15 agents. Again, back to my plumbing and existing structures. They cannot open directly to ingredient or edible storage, processing, packaging, labeling, or cookware and equipment storage. More considering that for the floor plan design, but if you're looking at a structure with existing bathrooms and you're kind of trying to navigate what that could look like, something to consider there. Cleanable walls and ceilings, pretty standard on that requirement. General waste, not cannabis waste. You have to have accessible containers. They have to be labeled very clearly for waste. They have to be easy cleanable, and they have to be emptied and cleaned daily. Just something to consider as well. Not so much on the floor plan, but waste generally is something to consider. Dumpsters that are going to be outside, how much space you're going to need for those dumpsters. Again, just something to consider there. You're also going to need a designated area for the receipt of ingredients that has a barrier to protect from, bugs, dust, any sort of contaminant that can possibly enter that space. You can use a dock. Again, back to the dock thing. I think it's a good win if you get a building with a dock, but not required. If you have one, you are allowed to, open the door to get this in for ingredients, but you have to reclose it and do an inspection to make sure that there's no contamination for the ingredients. Ingredient storage, right? You got dry storage, refrigerated storage, freezer storage, hazard ingredient storage. Existing structures that facilitate that and make that easy, great. They don't, just something to consider when thinking about floor plan and cost. And then toxic material storage, kind of hit on that before, but think about where your toxic chemicals are going to be stored as well, especially when you're in your bulk containers. Now, all of this is going to feed into your floor plan and your standard operating procedures. Your SOPs, you're going to need to submit for your final license. So as you're designing a floor plan, they're going to largely inform what these SOPs look like. There are going to be things that, the regulators may flag as an issue. Your own security teams, your own, production teams may say, you know what, this is a concern for me, contamination. And the answer may not be something like build a wall. It may be put in a policy. So a lot of your floor plan and a lot of the building is going to inform what these SOPs look like. And the best thing to do is get off on the right foot, because if you're able to look at this high level, big picture, what is going to go on in this building? How does it have to happen? Right from when you're vetting it and doing the floor plan, you don't have to make crazy changes and funky workarounds in your day-to-day to maintain compliance. You want to make sure that your SOPs are obviously, available to each agent, and they actually need to be available in the form an agent understands. So it isn't just a copy paste of the regs, boom, here you go, good luck. You need to take those and make them something somebody can understand. And I always say, make compliance easy. So I don't need to know as an agent that, some of these very minute details, but I may just need to know that I need to check the temperature in a particular storage area that needs between a certain range. Great. You want to make sure that life is easier for them. If they need to prevent contamination, you have trimmers, right, in a grow room. Make one trimmer container that says clean and one that says dirty. That's all they need to know, is that they put the clean in the clean, they put the dirty in the dirty. But what they've done is effectuate operational compliance. End rant. You also need your SOPs available on site for inspection, and they need to accurately reflect the procedures used at the premises. I can't stress enough how important it is to make sure your SOPs are accurate to what is really going on in the day-to-day.
Thank you, Casey. So just a few things to think about, really, once you kind of find a property that complies with all setbacks, you've gone and, kind of done your municipal due diligence, you've done some compliance due diligence, you're ready to move forward. You're going to move into the execution of agreements to secure your property interest. And this is important not only because it's a legally binding contract, also because it's going to be disclosed to the MCA as part of your final license application and will be reviewed as part of the final license process. We can go to the next one. Kind of highlighting the 3 different types of legal documents that we typically see in the cannabis industry, kind of by, order of prevalence, if you will. So you're going to likely enter into a letter of intent. That letter of intent will either be letter of intent to lease or letter of intent to buy, and is going to include kind of the initial sketch of terms that will later be incorporated. But basically, this is kind of used for efficiency's sake to get everybody on board, so that, to the extent that you need to pursue municipal approvals, you can kind of get that started before you execute a lease or a P&S. And then assuming that all goes well, then you'll move into the lease and purchase and sale agreement. So I just want to highlight a few kind of components of these types of agreements to keep in mind. First, with a lease, for the most part, kind of a commercial lease has many kind of rote clauses that are going to be included kind of regardless of the use, but there are specific things that are going to impact cannabis-specific lease terms that you want to have on your radar. Again, you're going to need to carve out any Controlled Substance Act. If you're kind of pulling a commercial lease from any other type of industry, there's likely going to be some clause in there that says that nothing at the site is going to, violate federal law. You don't want that in your lease agreement because you're going to be violating it on day one. So make sure that that's not included. Also make sure that the cannabis related activity is specifically permitted under the lease. That's absolutely something that, the MCA is going to be looking for in reviewing this. Similarly, insurance clauses are inherent in any sort of commercial lease agreement. You're going to want to make sure who's responsible for what coverage. Typically in a lease agreement, if you're a grower, the landlord is likely going to have kind of the building insurance, and then the tenant is going to need to obtain insurance for everything inside the 4 walls. That's kind of its own, its own webinar as well, insurance for your cannabis business. But again, it's a lot of these kind of rote clauses that can get carried over from another commercial lease that may not be, beneficial to a cannabis licensee that you're going to want to make sure you're paying attention to. Similarly for indemnification, for environmental considerations, as you could tell from Casey's presentation, kind of the plumbing, water usage, all these things can be a big component, especially in grow operations. So you're going to want to make sure that there's kind of indemnification provisions and who's responsible for what. Other kind of common terms, you're going to want to make sure that kind of the governing law, dispute resolution, and venue, these are again typical for commercial leases. Ensure the venue is in state court, but you also may want to consider including an arbitration clause. Arbitration essentially allows, potential litigants to resolve a dispute outside of public courts. So something to consider, it's kind of a privacy purpose. Obviously, any sort of litigation lawsuit will become public record and can be reported on. So there's a bit of a PR consideration there, just not something to be overlooked. Again, I think another kind of crucial clause to include in any lease is to potentially include kind of a possible reformation so that it will allow the parties to renegotiate if the MCA has specific feedback on some of the terms. If you're working with an attorney, particularly an attorney with experience in the cannabis industry, they should be able to ensure that that's kind of not an issue. But again, this type of reformation provision that's going to allow the parties to renegotiate if required to by the MCA, that's going to likely, be well received by the MCA and include kind of the wiggle room that you may need to get things done. So as I mentioned at the outset, a letter of intent is kind of what we see most frequently in the cannabis industry to kind of kick off a property agreement. The reason for this is that it can frequently include a 60 to 90 day runway to allow the licensee to get local approvals, like a building permit, and you would pay for the option to enter into a letter of intent to lease agreement, but that option payment is likely going to be lower than, the monthly rent that will commence once you execute a lease. So this is going to allow some time for the licensee to, make sure that they're actually going to be able to operate at the selected site. And it's going to allow the licensee to terminate their obligation to lease if they can't obtain all local approvals and state approvals to the extent that that's kind of negotiated. But I think it's typically more focused on local approvals because the state approvals can, have a longer runway. In order to have a letter of intent satisfy property control in Maryland, our recommendation is to make it binding and ideally to make it binding and exclusive. That means that, if you're a licensee, you enter into a letter of intent, the landlord isn't also shopping this property to, a bunch of other dispensary owners and just seeing who gets it first. Obviously, this is going to depend on a site by site and landlord by landlord basis, but something to really keep in mind as you go through this process. Finally, purchase and sales agreements. We see this less frequently in the cannabis industry, in part because it just typically requires, more capital upfront. And typically capital, particularly when you're kind of starting out your business, you want to kind of reserve that for other operations, not just real estate. Other things to consider here, again, kind of the municipal approval due diligence, which we've spoken about. But also title insurance and financing. Again, it would likely be challenging to obtain kind of a mortgage or loan to purchase a property that's going to be used for a cultivation or, licensed facility. So another option to secure a property, but one that's certainly less common in the cannabis industry.
All right, I'll take this one, Meg, real quick, so we can wrap up with this. But obviously, as you progress, you find the location and you're working through the inspection process. Securing reliable vendors is just as important as understanding what you're getting into, and all of the things that I talked about with different areas and plumbing and all of those really important, and legal documents. But a vendor can really make or break how this rollout goes for you. You're possibly going to involve a huge amount of vendors, from construction teams to security teams, and the people that do your mill work for a dispensary, for example. There's going to be a team that maybe comes in and does your lighting. Regardless, you're going to have a really good team in place. And one thing to keep in mind is that architects and other vendors don't necessarily need to have a cannabis background to be really, really, really good at what they do and move efficiently and effectively. But it is recommended in that if it's possible to have one, because just understanding how the inspections work, the time frame, the fact that like sometimes it's a hurry up and go type of situation, and that, you know, time is of the essence. There's going to be things that don't make sense, things that don't match the regs perfectly, but they just need to be done. They need to be done quick. And that's something that's unique to the cannabis industry sometimes. And, you know, making sure vendors are comfortable with that is super important. So if they have the cannabis background, that's great. I would say also be very careful in choosing your vendors, right? They have a cannabis background, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't vet them fully. What is their cannabis background? Do they have references? There's a lot of people now, the cannabis industry has matured, that have cannabis backgrounds, but just having that may not make them suitable for you as a vendor. You know, I can't stress the importance enough of conducting frequent compliance reviews throughout the construction process, right from the floor plan. You get your wiring in place. Your wiring in place is going to have to involve your security vendors to make sure your cameras and your alarms and everything is in place. Really, as you go through this entire process, as you're planning this all out, that moment where everyone needs to go, stop, hold on. Is this actually compliant? Is this really going to work? Or is this a situation where I put the walls up, I did the wiring, and I missed 3 cameras in this space? I have to take this all down, and this is going to cost me a fortune to bring back all these vendors and do this all over again. So it is so important to just give a pause as you work through each phase, make sure you have the right vendors involved, and review compliance. So that way you can fast track getting this through the inspections and ultimately approved and operational. Engaging with MBE, all applicants submitted your detailed diversity plan within your initial application, which likely included representations with respect to working with minority business enterprises. The diversity plan is a requirement for the supplemental application. So as you're also going through all of this planning phase, make sure you review and plan for compliance accordingly. You can research some potential vendors. We put the link in there. And the Office of Social Equity is also a resource for that. Something to keep in mind. Vendors, also think about what your diversity plan looks like and compliance with that as you work through the build out phase here. And lastly, the MCA inspections. This is something that's kind of developing now as more licensees come on board. So you're going to see some changes. You're going to see, as they stack up, some changes in opinion, the way things are interpreted, and that's expected in any industry and not unique to Maryland or cannabis, right? So the administration, you know, may award a license on determination that all inspections are passed and all the specifications of the application as approved, right? That means your SOP has to match the actual operations. And during those inspections, when you describe what's going on, it needs to match the SOP. The inspection, you'll schedule that with MCA, figure out what works for both of you, make sure you have the right team members there to answer the question. Can't stress that enough. And keep in mind, you get through the inspections, you're operational. They're going to do unannounced inspections. They can do it. They will do it. So keep that in mind as you're operational. And again, the best thing to do is put your best foot forward at that first inspection. So to make sure you are fully prepared for this inspection, you understand compliance, you understand your SOPs and how everything works in your facility, because that's really your first impression. And you don't want to be all over the place or be someone that MCA is questioning your ability to comply with the regulations. So pre-inspection compliance review will save you, 1, you know, your first really good impression, and 2, ideally you won't be in a situation where you're adding cameras or alarms or changing anything around after that first inspection.
So we've thrown a lot at everyone today, but hopefully you all found it informative and helpful as you embark on this process. It's over 1 at this point, so please feel free to follow up with either Casey and I with any questions, and we'll be sure to get back to you to answer your questions as soon as we can. But, you know, we're here to help, and we're excited for the market and for all the new conditional licensees. And please think of us as you move through this process. And thank you again so much for taking this time with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks all.